This video is presented by newwoodworker.com. When it comes to squaring your miter gauge, you got to decide if you want to do it the fast, sort of accurate way or the fast, really accurate way. While you're thinking about that, we'll look at the differences. Using a framing square to get your miter gauge fence square to your blade is fast, but it's not so accurate. I shim this blade to make its alignment bad enough that you can actually see it on camera. Hopefully the amounts of misalignment in your blade are way smaller than this. But regardless of how small the misalignment is, when we use the framing square method, we're reproducing that error in the miter gauge fence. To make this framing square technique work, we'd have to be able to adjust the angle of the miter slot, not the miter gauge fence. A misaligned blade will make a wider curve because it's cutting off of two opposite edges. In this demonstration, the blade is canted so that the front edge of the blade is closest to the miter slot. And I'll go ahead and use the framing square to make the miter gauge fence square to the blade. The problem here is that the framing square actually is accurate. If you're careful, you can make the miter gauge actually square to the blade. And that includes however far out of parallel the blade is to the miter slot. We know that the front of the blade is what's producing the final sizing of the board, so we put the board against that, and because the miter gauge rides in the miter slot that's straight, this is how much error we already have at the back end of it. Now hopefully your amount of error will be way less than this, but it's still there, and we know it is. And with every cut you make, that amount of error accumulates. Have you ever cut 4 pieces for a box and glued them together and all went fine until you got to the last joint and those pieces were out of line by 1/4 of an inch vertically? That error at the last joint is caused by the miter gauge fence being square to a blade that's not exactly parallel to the miter slot. What's really frustrating is that aligning the miter gauge to the miter slot is just as easy as aligning it to the blade, but this eliminates that error. I use a 14-inch artist square and put the short leg against the fence on the miter gauge. Loosen the miter gauge fence and align the long edge of the triangle with the edge of the miter slot. When the long edge of the artist square follows the edge of the miter slot perfectly, lock the miter gauge down and you're done. This way, if the blade is out of line a little bit and cutting off at this one edge, the miter gauge is going to move the wood perfectly straight and we'll get a perfectly square cut. That's because this time the wood is being held perfectly square to the miter slot, not the blade. To show this in action, I've adjusted the miter gauge fence so that it's square to a blade that's not parallel to the miter slot, and we'll draw a straight line on our stock here. And yes, I did take that shim out of my blade so it doesn't blow up when I start it. Now when I make this cut with the miter gauge square to the blade, I'm going to start with a cut line on the back edge of the blade like you would normally. Watch the blade as it starts on that square line and then cuts across and out the other side. Now again, we've exaggerated the error so you can see it clearly, but this is exactly what happens when you square the miter gauge to the blade. Now I'm going to draw another square line across the same board. And this time I'll start to cut a little to the side of the line so we can see if it stays parallel to the line. This time I'll use the artist square to line the miter gauge fence to the miter slot. And that's really how long it takes to do that. And we'll make the cut just a little to the side of that line. And you can see how parallel the cut is to the layout line we drew. So it's your choice. You want to do it right, or you just like using the framing square. And if you just got to use a framing square, we can use it to set up for a 45-degree miter cut. If you hold the framing square against the miter gauge fence and turn it so that the 5s on the inside edges line up with the miter slot, it's at a perfect 45-degree angle.